La ley universal de la locomoción no puede...
Seja bem-vindo, welcome. I can't describe how happy I am to be here, and surprised in a way. And actually, can we bring Mark in? I want to describe the scene to him.
I can see you all, and it's very exciting to get to see you. I'm delighted to be able to join you this morning.
Hey, Mark, I want to describe what we're looking at here. So I'm in this round arena with 800 of the best consultants in the world on the planet. And it's really moving. The kind of thing that we've been trying to do with students is sitting in the room in front of us.
Yeah, I can see the space, and it looks like a really exciting event that you're at. So I wish I could be there.
Well, and Mark is a dedicated teacher, and so it's the beginning of the school year at Olin College, and so when I try to get Mark to travel during the school year, I'm always unsuccessful, but I'm glad that he could join us by video conference today. So it's our habit when Mark and I work together to get the audience involved immediately. Learning is an active activity done well, and so let me get my little clicker here, and actually, so I want you to reflect on the following question. So you just saw the title slide, the making of a whole new consultant, development of the management school in Falconi. So what Mark and I would like you to do right now is to pair up or triple up right at your table, right in your seats, and have a short conversation on this question. When you saw the title of this talk, what did you hope to hear or learn today? So, and if you'd like, you can use the pigeonhole to tweet, not questions, but your reflections, your answers to these questions. And then after, we're going to do that for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back together, and then we'll have a conversation about that and where the talk is going to go. So is my request clear? Get in groups of 2 or 3. We'll have a conversation on this question for 5 minutes. You can pigeonhole, and then we're going to have a short conversation about that. You ready? Go ahead and get busy. Form groups of 2 or 3 and start talking. Let's take another half minute or so, 30 seconds. Okay, so let's come back together. I'd like to get a sense. Of course, we can't go around to every group that was talking, but we can't get a sense of what some of the ideas that are in the room. So, and I think there's some microphones, people with microphones standing around. So, what did you hope to hear or learn? Anyone? Sir.
I guess that answer to that question is a little bit challenging, but what we just talked here is that I try to figure out what gather these groups you are challenged to transform in education. So I hope to hear what is the glue that gather these people. You know, because I asked him what. Is there a figure of a leader in this group that is the same
beautiful.
Of it?
Yeah. So what's the glue that brings people together, and what's the sort of and there's something about leadership in that too.
And is there a need to a glue in this group, or this is unnecessary?
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Great insight. Great question. What else did you hope to see?
Hi.
Okay.
So I was talking to a fellow chemical engineer, and we studied in different universities, and we were talking that we want to understand how we can get this revolution back to our schools, because we know that the quality of the course is really bad, and it has a big room for improvement.
Yeah.
So we want to know how we can apply this here and make our education here better.
Yeah, so it's the direct application of ideas from other universities back to universities in Brazil, and there is a movement. You know, so Professor Falconi mentioned the INSPIR Foundation and the revolution that's going on at UFMG, and so one of the ways to spread that is to form community. Great stuff. Thank you. What else? What else did you hope to?
Hi.
Yes.
I hope to learn here today. How is this revolution happen in the United States, and how to apply here in Brazil?
Yes.
And this revolution, how to help our consulting to be better.
Yeah, so the revolution in education, and then what does this stuff mean for consulting, the consultant of the future? How do you educate the consultant of the future? And actually, is there something about the revolution that's more fundamental and deeper? Yeah. Great stuff. Beautiful. What else? Maybe one. Yes, thank you.
Is it working? Hi, Dave. Morning. We were discussing here, me and my fellow consultants, that we received it with great excitement because last year it was announced Falconi University.
Yes.
And I think you guys are going to come in like a branch to show how you did it at Allen in revolutionizing education. So mostly how to do it practically, and how especially to engage people not only rationally, but also emotionally into achieving a greater, bigger goal into this revolution, towards this revolution.
I see Mark nodding his head. Yes, so I mean, so how do you do this practically? This is, after all, a consultancy that is about results, right?
Exactly.
And so, but also, how do you do it with heart? And
exactly.
From what my read is that this is a consultancy that has heart too. So, but how do we make that even bigger? Beautiful. What else? Wait, one more comment, one more takeaway. Yep.
Good morning.
Hi.
I had an experience at my university with a project-based learning course.
Yes.
And soon after, I realized that the professor was just trying to use it as an excuse not to give a theoretical course. How can we connect a strong course to develop critical thinking with a pragmatic use of those frameworks?
Yeah, beautiful question. And sometimes people use those buzzwords like project-based learning and active learning. They use the language of those things, but they don't do it from a place of authenticity. It doesn't come from the right place emotionally. And so beautiful. No, this is great. And so one more. Yeah. Yep.
Hi, just for like the title itself, it says like the making of a whole new consortium.
Yes.
And I would like to know, we will discuss here, and what exactly is like this new consortium? Because we have like point A and point B. A is like today, and B is where like the whole new consortium. So what's going to be the difference from the consortium from today, from the like the one that you aim to like mode? And what are the differences? So because like today is not really that great, so we have to make it like a whole new consultant. What's really like the odds of that happening?
Yeah, so great question. So in what's, so is now so bad that we need to make a whole new one? And if so, what's different about it? And I learned yesterday about points A and point B and bridges between them. So beautiful stuff. Yeah. So I think we need to. So we're gonna have lots of time at the end to sort of get deeper reflections about the talk. So let's move ahead a little bit and switching to the PowerPoint. And Mark and I want to share some of our stories, and this stuff is very personal. So if you look at Mark and my early careers, there's no reason why we should be here talking to you. So, Mark, why don't you start and share your personal journey a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to do that, Dave. So if you can go to the next slide. So we're going to start by getting into a time machine, and that time machine is going to take us all the way back in time to a time when I was very young. 1985 is the year that we're in, and in 1985 I had just graduated from high school, and I was trying to decide what I ought to do with my life. And I went first to the University of Texas at Austin. Next slide, Dave. And at the University of Texas at Austin, I couldn't quite decide what to do. And so at the University of Texas at Austin, I first studied electrical engineering, and I also studied English literature. I spent 5 years at the University of Texas at Austin, and I had a great time there. I enjoyed being a student. In fact, I enjoyed being a student so much that I decided I would go to England and spent a couple of years in England studying physics. And so I went to Oxford University and studied physics there for a couple of years, and trying to further extend my life as a student. I then went to MIT in the East Coast of the US, and at MIT I got a PhD in electrical engineering. And to be honest with you, there were a couple of reasons that I spent so long being a student. One was maybe that I didn't want to know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so by spending a lot of time studying, I was able to avoid that question. But the other thing that was maybe important was that during that time, I was exposed to a lot of different educational experiences, from a big state school in the US to Oxford University and the tutorial system to MIT. And I realized as I had those experiences that what I really cared about the most was the actual educational experience. And so by the time that I was getting close to finishing my PhD at MIT, it seemed to me pretty clear that I should be doing something that was in this space of education. Well, you can imagine that I was pretty excited when in 1997 I was finishing my degree. So if you go to the next slide, Dave. And in 1997, as I was finishing my degree, the Franklin W. Olin Foundation announced that it was going to take $500 million and use that money to start a new college that was intended to revolutionize engineering education. And I looked at that and I thought, this is the thing for me. This is the most exciting thing possible. This is exactly what I ought to do. The problem was that it was 1997. They weren't actually starting the college for another 3 or 4 years. And so I had to do something else. I went and worked for a little while at another university, one of the top liberal arts colleges in the US. But then in 2001, I had the opportunity to go to Olin and join Olin. Now I'll show you what Olin looks like today. Dave, if you go to the next slide. So this is what Olin looks like today. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see what Olin looked like when I joined Olin in 2001. Olin was basically a house in a suburb of Boston. My office was next to the bathroom on the second floor of the house. I was fortunate enough not to actually have my office in the bathroom, which was what one of my colleagues had. It was very much a startup environment. And I had a great time being part of that startup, being part of that initial team in the startup, and have been at Olin since that time, building the institution, but also over time starting to work with other institutions as they try to start up new programs. So I've been helping out with INSPIR. Dave and I have been doing a lot of things through the Big Beacon Network, and certainly one of the really critical events at Olin was the point where Dave and I first met each other through a partnership between Olin and the University of Illinois. So that's sort of how I got to where I am today. It's not a particularly expected journey. It's a sort of surprising one, but I'm delighted to have had that opportunity to be part of the startup at Olin and now to be a part of trying to transform engineering education more broadly.
And thanks for sharing that, Mark. And my journey was equally unlikely. So I started my career after leaving the University of Michigan with a master's degree as a consultant at a company called Stoner Associates. Today it's grown, and I graduated in '76 and worked for this company called Stoner Associates, which is today called Advantica, and they do computer-based solutions of fluid flow systems. And so I went to work with an entrepreneur named Mike Stoner in a new building in a cornfield in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So I was the first engineer. He had a secretary in this new building. And it was a beautiful experience in entrepreneurship. But I left and went back and got a PhD at Michigan, and I applied a form of artificial intelligence called genetic algorithms to gas pipelines. And that turned out to be what I did for the next 20 years. I went and took a job at the University of Alabama, and then the University of Illinois. And I was your ordinary research professor who had a lab and graduate students. And I paid attention to my teaching, but undergraduate teaching wasn't a big thing for me then. But in the fall of '93, I was in the dean's office as an assistant dean, and I was reflecting on, well, what's working and not working? And I wrote a paper called Change in Engineering Education back in '93, so this is a long time ago. If you go look at that paper, a lot of the things that weren't true then are now true today. But I showed it to my dean, a guy named Bill Showalter, great guy, great dean, changed Illinois in many important ways, but I showed it to him and he just thought I was insane, because I was challenging many of the assumptions of the modern research university, and he just said, well, this is crazy stuff, and I figured for the benefit of my career, I should just go back to work and do my genetic algorithms, and I did that. But then on May 24th, and you can go see this, I wrote a blog post that changed my life. And the title of it was Philosophy of Engineering, Not a Contradiction in Terms, and I was speculating, why don't we have a philosophy of engineering like there's a philosophy of science? And I put that out there, and a guy from the UK wrote back and said the Institution for Civil Engineers was interested in this, and other people in Europe were interested in this. And so I went to a colleague named Michael Louie, who's now at Purdue, and said, hey, something's going on. And we started a little network, but we didn't. Michael thought philosophy was too narrow, so we called it Engineering and Technology Studies at Illinois. And that was the beginning of what became I Foundry, the Illinois Foundry for Innovation and Engineering Education that's discussed in the book. So this is about 2006, and I'm going to tell some stories about I Foundry and what happened, but the efforts at I Foundry were surprisingly successful in a short time, and I said, I just have to go out in the world and see how this stuff really works out there. So on the last day of 2010, I left the University of Illinois. I resigned my tenure. I resigned my distinguished professorship to go out in the world and see what this was about, and started a company called Three Joy Associates. The name Three Joy comes from the three joys of I Foundry: the joy of engineering, the joy of learning, and the joy of community. And so went out in the world. My first stop was National University of Singapore. I worked with Dean Chanang Soon out there and on his design-centric curriculum, and we started some coursework on what were some of the fundamental changes that were needed. And those changes were influenced by my experience of becoming a leadership coach. I took training at Georgetown University in 2010 and 2011 to be a trained leadership coach, and so now part of my practice is to work with leaders both in academia and industry to help them adjust to these modern times. One of the early stops on the tour, thanks to Professor Falconi, was UFMG, and worked with Alessandro Moreira and still do. And I think one of the things that people in Brazil need to appreciate is the importance of the revolution that's going on in engineering education. Some of the things that are happening at UFMG and INSPIR are global best practices, but people don't know about it yet. So here's our joint time machine. Mark and I started working together, it was back in 2008.
Yep.
Yeah, and we put on 2009. We put on something called the Engineer of the Future at Olin. It was a great event to try to get people aligned with this revolution. And we worked together on the founding of Big Beacon and the writing of the Big Beacon Manifesto, and we worked together on the book that all of you have gotten, and I appreciate the comments that many of you have shared about the book. But here's the thing. Our work is on the future of education, and this is a consultancy that's about results. So how does the future of education, higher education, engineering education, translate to the future of consulting? And Mark and I don't have answers to that. We have good questions. We have some things that we know worked inside of education. Mark, do you want to have anything to say?
I guess it was interesting to me in the initial reflections, the extent to which folks were really asking for the answer to that question about how our work connects to the future of consulting. And I think in many ways, we don't know the answer. That's an answer that you're going to have to figure out. We do think that there's a lot of stuff that is important in the work that we've done that may well be really parallel to the work that you're trying to do in consulting. So we think there are parallels, but we don't know if they are, and we think what's really important is to actually have the conversation and start to reflect on whether those parallels exist.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that in the context. On the plane over, I read a couple of Professor Falconi's books, and I was reflecting on the method and the finding of anomalies when you go out into the workplace, the finding of anomalies. So what are the anomalies in our lives now? What are the, actually yesterday was a discussion of anomalies in our society, in Brazilian society in particular. So what are those anomalies, and in what ways can consultancy change to help improve some of those anomalies? So, and this slide, we think there are parallels, as Mark just said. What there are parallels maybe in the forces for change. We're changing at a particular moment in history for cause. Some of the processes to change, some of the things that we're doing now may be similar to the things that we're trying to change in higher and engineering education. Number three, this idea of culture and emotion of change we think is fundamental. So how do we get to an operating system that moves from fear and obedience to love? And Professor Falconi in his opening remarks talked about Falconi as a school. And you have a university, Falconi, but actually when you go out into the world and you learn, what did you say? You said it's a school that makes money. I love that. And so what are the changes in the university that will help Falconi do good for its customers and turn a profit? So I think this historical background, why are we here? Why are we talking about this now in 2015? And I think there are good reasons for that. And this is a bit of a caricature. But if we think of if we think of expertise, consultancy is based on expertise, right? So if we think of expertise, when does that start in human history? Well, it's hard to pinpoint, but certainly one of the milestones in the history of expertise is the founding of the modern university. And most people point to the University of Bologna in 1088. So we're talking about the 11th century. And if you think of the university from that point forward, it's really very much the same. It's had some upgrades. So in the 11th century, somebody found some Roman law in Pisa and started teaching it, and students came and paid money, and they took the law back to their places, and they made livings off of that. And going forward, that kind of accumulation of experts that would tell to students, hasn't changed very much. We get experts, we bring them together. It's kind of an assembly of experts model. If we come forward, fast forward into the 19th century, and the German model of the university as a research university, it just got more intense. And so if you come to the modern research university post-World War II, it's still a place, it's still an assembly of experts. And if we parallel that with the history of consulting, there's no chicken or egg problem in consulting. Consulting has a very recent history going back to 1886 and the formation of Arthur D. Little, a chemistry professor at MIT, going out into the world, selling his services first in a technical area and realizing that the real interesting problems and the real money to be made was in management consulting. Frederick Winslow Taylor and the idea of scientific management formed a consultancy in 1890. So, and actually this, if you look at this historically, this is about the same time that business schools formed in earnest. Engineering schools predated business schools. Business schools came in at the end of the 19th century. Then in terms of the practices here, a lot of quality consulting and management consulting for results goes back to the statistical methods of Shewhart, by the way, a University of Illinois graduate, back in 1924. And then, of course, we all remember Deming and his work. He worked first in the government and then went over to Japan, and the rest is history. And of course, we come forward to Professor Falconi's work in the 60s and 70s at UFMG that led to the founding of INDG and this company. So, all that's kind of history, but what's changing? What's new about experts and expertise today? Well, to see that, let's rewind a little bit. We came forward, let's go back. I've got a little VCR or a little DVD I can go back and rewind. So let's go back to World War II. And if we think about industry after World War II, what's it about? I love this picture. This is the Ford Rouge plant in 1947. And you look at, of course, it looks like it's an old black and white photo, but the artifact that I like to point to in this picture, what's that ship? What's that ship doing there? That's an ore freighter. In 1947, Henry Ford was making his own steel. What do we say today? We say, stick to your core competence. There was no sticking to your core competence in 1947. There was just economies of scale all the way down. And so people they had their own mines, they had their own steel, they did everything. And something happened in between then and now that we now talk about sticking to your core competence. But what were organizations like then? Well, William White wrote The Organization Man in 1956 and talked about this uniformity, the uniformity of managers at that time. So it's kind of a uniform workforce, everyone believing the same thing, wearing the same thing. And what was information like in the 40s and 50s? It was hard to get. It was expensive, and if you had it, you didn't share it. All right, so what happened in between then and now? Well, we call these the three missed revolutions. They're not missed by industry. We call them missed because they're missed by the academy. Higher education has missed these things. And what are they? The quality revolution, which you guys know about, the entrepreneurial revolution, which you guys also know about, and the IT revolution, which you guys know about. So those three things happened in between, and now we live in a world where Ford doesn't make its own steel, it sticks to its core competence. And some organizations get big, but some stick to their core competence. And those that get big on network effects, and the book talks about that a little bit. And then if you look at thought leaders now, they're all talking about the same thing. Dan Pink talks about we need a whole new mind. Tom Friedman says the world is flat. And Richard Florida says there's the rise of the creative class. So everyone's talking about innovation. Nobody was talking about innovation in the 50s. Now everyone is. So what's that about? Well, it's partially about how information has changed. Now, any 14-year-old with a laptop can read the same papers as an expert. So it's a lot of information and knowledge is free. And we share it more widely than we used to. We don't hold it and sequester it. Information gets out now because it can. So we live in this different world, and we have the ways in which information is changed. And we think of this as the information asymmetry has been reduced in important ways. But here's the thing. What does that mean for being a consultant? What does that mean for being an expert? Well, returns, we're about results. We're about economics, right? An economist would say it this way: returns to expertise are diminished. That doesn't mean they're zero, but being an expert isn't what it once was. Anyone can read about the method online. $13.99, you get a Kindle copy of the book, you read it. Now, that doesn't mean they know everything about it, but information's more widely shared. And so what we'd like to do in the remainder is relate to this history and tell stories about what we think this means for universities. And as Mark was saying before, we need you to work with us because we don't have the answers. We believe that you have the answers. And so here's our request. As we tell these three stories that we're going to tell, we want you to reflect on the university story and think about how does the university story carry over to educating consultants and to changing consulting practice. What do our stories mean for you? Is it clear what I'm asking you to think about? Because at the end, we're going to come back and have another interactive conversation about exactly that. We want to hear what you think our stuff means for your stuff. Is it clear what I'm asking you to think about? Okay, good. So Mark, why don't you, and at the end we want your thoughts for consultants and consulting. Let me go a little bit more before I bring Mark into the conversation again. So let's reflect about this expertise just a little bit more. What's an expert? Well, we can probably do and I've been hanging out with philosophers a little bit over the last 5-6 years, and so we can make this pretty complicated, but one of the values of Falconi is simplicity. So I'm going to keep this simple. What's an expert? An expert says, I know something, and I can help you with that something. So in the context of a university, what's a university? It's an assembly of experts. It's a bunch of people saying, I know, in different disciplines. Now, that worked when returns to expertise were high, but returns to expertise are diminished. So how do we balance? What do you do when you're facing a risky situation? You balance your portfolio. How do we balance the portfolio in a university is the answer we're going to give. What do we balance I know with? And we want to answer that in a few ways, but we need to look at the I know perspective is the faculty member's perspective. What about the student's perspective on this? What has the university been to a student? Well, it's that knower tells and the student listens and obeys. And also, there's a little bit of fear in there. If you don't obey and you don't learn the thing the master tells you, then there's punishment. And so how do we balance the emotional context of the university and the obedience and the listening and the passiveness of the university with something else? And so what's the opposite of expertise and obedience? And we want to answer that with 3 stories, and Mark's going to kick off with the story of the beginning of Olin.
Okay, well, as I said earlier, I joined Olin back when we were in a house. And when you're starting a college, there are a lot of things you have to do. So if you go to the next slides, Dave, one of the things that you have to do is you have to actually recruit students. And so Olin actually started recruiting students very early in the process. In fact, back in 1999, Olin started to send out material to students, and that material was kind of edgy and fun marketing material. For example, this flyer says, you can't get into our college in 2000 because we don't exist yet. And the sort of idea was to get lots of students really excited about this new college that didn't exist, to sort of build some energy around that. But I want you to sort of zoom in on something really important on this flyer. So if you go to the next slide, Dave. If you look closely on this next slide, you'll see that you can't get into our college in 2000 because we don't exist yet. And then the next line is, Franklin W. Olin College of Engineering won't open until the fall of 2001. So I want you to keep that date in your mind. So one of the things you need to do when you open a college is recruit students. Another thing you need to do is build buildings, right? You actually need to have a physical infrastructure to build a college. So during the time that they had started doing the recruiting for students, we also started to design and construct the buildings with the intention of opening them in fall 2001. Well, if you go to the next slide, this is what Olin looked like in the fall of 2001. As usually happens in construction, the schedules were behind, the contractors had promised things that they couldn't actually deliver on, and in fact, it became clear as early as the fall of 2000 that there was no way that Olin was actually going to be able to open its doors to students in the fall of 2001. That was a little bit of a problem, and it was actually a pretty big problem because the recruiting for students that had been going on was very, very successful. Olin had lots of highly, highly qualified, really excited high school seniors who were saying, please let me into Olin. And at the same time, it didn't have buildings and didn't have a curriculum to allow those students to take part in coming to Olin. And so the college was stuck between a rock and a hard place. They could either say, well, we made a mistake, we're not going to open in 2001, in which case they would have a major marketing problem, or they could throw away those sort of very good students and say, oh, okay, we're going to start over again, we're going to start in a different year, we know you were interested, but forget about it. So this had the potential to be what you would call a marketing disaster. And so the college got together and tried to decide what was the right thing to do, and came up with a plan that was very much a plan born of necessity. They said, how can we take this bad situation and turn it into a positive opportunity? What if we, instead of admitting students in the fall of 2001, admit students who we call partners, and we ask them to help to actually design and build the college? And so in the fall of 2000, and Dave, if you go to the pivot slide, in the fall of 2000, this decision was made to, instead of recruiting students, to recruit partners. We changed the marketing material to talk about not how wonderful the college was, but how by coming to the college, you would be taking a big leap and be fearless and take part in designing this new college. And that actually turned out to be a very successful approach because it ended up resulting in lots and lots of students being very excited about the idea of getting to build their own college. Then we were faced with another problem. How do we actually recruit students to a college that doesn't exist? We don't actually have anything to show them. And so in the spring of 2001, we invited students to come to the campus of a nearby college and not to actually show them what Olin was going to be like by showing them PowerPoint presentations, but instead by having them work with each other to learn what it would be like to design and build things together. So students were doing various kinds of design activities, they were meeting each other and meeting the faculty members, and they were all very, very excited. In fact, they were so excited that the Dean of Admissions said to the president, we actually can only admit 30 of these students because we only have 30 spots, and anyone that we admit is so excited they're going to come. So they decided at that point that they would admit 30 students. They did admit 30 students, and in the fall of 2001, 29 of those students arrived on campus, along with one additional student who came off of the wait list. We also had 10 very opinionated faculty, including myself, on campus at that time, but we didn't actually have a campus. We didn't actually have a curriculum. The only thing we had was a promise that all of us would work together to actually design this college. During the course of that year, we did a lot of stuff. We had a lot of arguments. We had a lot of experiences with students where we tried things out. And we did actually produce a very ambitious first draft of the curriculum that had all kinds of wonderful features in it. Finally, we recruited an additional 45 students so that in the fall of 2002, we were ready to actually kick off this new curriculum. So I want to tell you a little bit about the fall of 2002. That first week was a week in which students were very, very excited. And faculty were very, very excited. Everyone had taken part in designing this new curriculum. Everyone was highly invested in what this great new institution was going to be. We were reinventing engineering education. It was the most exciting thing in the world. I want to fast forward 2 weeks into that first semester. 2 weeks into that first semester, students started coming to class and falling asleep in class. students started crying in class and telling us that things were not working. Basically, students were miserable. And the reason that students were miserable was because we as faculty were asking them to do too much. We were asking them to go above and beyond. We'd assumed that they were capable of anything. And because they were partners in this, because they saw themselves as responsible, they were actually trying to do everything. And so everyone was working far harder than was actually feasible. And this was really a critical point in the history of the college, in my opinion, because what we did is on a Friday afternoon or on a Friday morning, handed the students envelopes in class. And they opened those envelopes, and in the envelopes there was a piece of paper that said, please proceed to the soccer fields. And I'm told that one of the students told me later that when she opened that envelope and she read that, she thought to herself, oh no, they're going to have us go outside and do some other completely impossible experiment. I can't possibly do this. But what actually happened when they went down to the soccer field was they found that we had set up a bouncy castle, one of these sort of trampolines that you can jump in. There were speakers set up, music playing, there were various games being played. We basically had a sort of carnival day where everyone blew off steam, and students really blew off steam. This is actually a picture of a student and a faculty member throwing eggs at each other, so it sort of gives you a sense of exactly what that day was like. And then critically, the next Monday, we came back into class and said to the students, hey guys, we screwed up. We're asking too much of you. You were asking too much of yourselves. We together need to figure out how we can fix this and how we can do things differently. And from that point, we sort of rejiggered the entirety of what we were doing that semester and what the entirety of what we were doing that year, and really sort of established a pattern with students of experimenting, but also being willing to listen to them and willing to change when things were going wrong. So that's where we were in 2002. And I just want to highlight what the situation was in 2002. In 2002, we had late buildings and a late curriculum. In 2002, we were having arguments galore. The faculty did not agree about anything in 2002. And believe me, having been at many of those faculty meetings, it was painful. And in 2002, we'd had a lot of disasters. Many things had not gone right, including the first 2 weeks of class. If you fast forward 13 years to today, Olin is now highly rated both nationally and internationally. We've won the Gordon Prize, which is the top prize in the United States for educational innovation in engineering. Our graduates are being employed by top companies like Apple and Google. They're going to top PhD programs like Stanford and MIT. We've had multiple startups come out of Olin that have raised millions of dollars, and we're visited yearly by hundreds of institutions, and also are working closely with institutions around the globe, including places like Innsbruck. So the question that we would pose to you is, how is it that Olin actually got to where it is today in 2015, given the failures that we started out with?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Mark, for sharing. I love hearing that story, and I always reflect on the way in which the partners year was such a central feature of the culture, and how that was an accident of the construction schedule. It's like,
yeah, it was completely a mistake.
Yeah. Let me tell a little bit about the founding of I Foundry and the interconnect to what Mark was just saying. So the I Foundry is the Illinois Foundry for Innovation and Engineering Education. It goes back to that blog post I did in 2006. 2007, a white paper is written. My dean at that time yawns, but we got 5 department heads or not 5 associate department heads from different departments at Illinois to say, hey, let's talk about this. And like Olin did, we got students together to talk about how do we transform engineering education at Illinois to make it friendlier, to make it so that kids don't want to drop out after their first year. And so one of the things we did we started a class called Design the Engineering Education of the Future, Engineering Curriculum of the Future. And we had 18 students sign up. 12 were undergraduate students and 6 were graduate students. And so 2 graduate students and I got on a plane and we visited different schools. One of the schools we visited was Olin, so we went to Olin after the buildings were built. And we were in a class. We were in a freshman class, first year class, second semester, first year class, and class was a little bit unusual in that the students were building things. They had built heat sinks to take heat away from a semiconductor, and so and they were in class that day. They were testing the heat sinks, and so the professors were in the front with the test equipment, and the students were waiting around for their test results. So the professor said, "Well, go talk to these guys from Illinois," and so we did, and a lot of what I remember from that day wasn't surprising at all. I expected the kids at Olin to be smart. They were smart. I expected them to be articulate. They were articulate. What I didn't expect was what happened next. They started to tell us stories of their colleagues in the previous class to this one, and how cool the devices were that they made, how technically sophisticated they were, how elegant the designs were. And I'm listening to this with my engineer's ears, and I'm going, oh my gosh, these kids are emotionally engineers already. Second semester, freshman year, they have the spirit of engineering in their hearts. And I'm going, my gosh. And at the time, we reflected on it and said, if all this stuff, we can't take the buildings back, but maybe we can take that spirit back. And we labeled that, this emotional engagement with engineering, we labeled that the Olin effect in I Foundry, and we said, well, that's in terms of the method, that's one of our targets. So now it's 2009, and we're going to admit our first freshmen. We admitted 73 freshmen into something called the Illinois Engineering Freshman Experience, and I can't stress how small a program this was. Olin was $500 million, new buildings, faculty dedicated to the proposition that engineering education should change. And here we are at the University of Illinois, a research powerhouse, where faculty are frankly indifferent to undergraduate students. And what do we have? We have basically about $100,000 budget to create what we called, in the book, we called it the pea shooter. We had a 1-credit course that met for 15 weeks, for 2 hours a week. The students got 1 credit for it. And it had the components that you see in this diagram on the slide. In the center, it's hard to read, but there was something called Introduction to the Missing Basics of Engineering, where somebody mentioned critical thinking earlier. We talked a lot about critical thinking and the ways in which those basics are just as important as math and science. We had something called the I community, where students were put on teams aligned with their aspirations. So when the students joined I Foundry to apply, in a similar way to what Olin does, we said, well, why do you want to be an engineer? Why do you want to be an I Foundry? And so students told us their aspirations, and they basically grouped into 3 clusters. Some students said, well, I want to be the next Max Levchin, the co-founder of PayPal. So basically they were saying they want to be the next great Illinois tech entrepreneur. We said, beautiful, we admire that. Some kids said, well, we want to change the world. We want to help people who are starving and impoverished, and we want to use our engineering to help people directly. We said, beautiful, we admire that. And some kids said, well, we want to create cool technology. And we said, we admire that. So we created teams aligned with their aspirations. We had a team called Engineering and Service to Society. We had a team called Entrepreneurship and Innovation. We had corporate sponsors for these teams. We had IBM and Hewlett Packard and architecture firms like Skidmore, Owings and Merrill up in Chicago, builder of some of the biggest skyscrapers in the world. And so we had all this stuff going. We had these 73 students, and at first it was great. So we've got, again, this little pea shooter, 1 credit, and a 0 credit extracurricular in this I community. All of our things had an I Foundry. The teams were called I teams. The chairs of the teams were I chairs. Everything was an I. So anyways, and we didn't get sued by Apple. So here's the I launch. We took the students, we had a low ropes course, we did some leadership and teamwork training. Kids loved it, got great reviews. But then we came back to campus and we had them on their teams, and they started to complain. was actually kind of bumpy in the middle. And actually, at the time, they had to, as part of the course, they had to blog. And you can read their blogs, I think, still today. And they complained bitterly. They said, oh, these I Foundry guys don't know what they're doing. They won't tell us what to do on our teams. And so the kids would come to me and say, well, Professor Goldberg, we're on the service to society, engineering and service to society team. What should we do? I said, I don't know. You want to save the world? Start saving. And the entrepreneurship team came and said, well, what should we do? I said, well, you're entrepreneurs. Go build something. And so we refused to tell them what to do. And I think that was a critical moment in I Foundry. And so other things started to happen in the course. They had a project where this was a one credit course. We had them build these steam cars, and they made this. It was kind of a fabrication and troubleshooting challenge. And they had other project kind of works, hands-on sorts of things. And in the middle of the semester, we had the I checkpoint, where students gave presentations about what their teams were doing. And here they are in third floor of the Coordinated Science Laboratory giving talks. You can see the kids with the green T-shirts. We encourage them to form identity and culture in their own teams, and so they made T-shirts to identify their desire to have more of a green world. So anyway, it was a great evening, and at the end, we told them we value improvement. So we had a Kaizen session. Said, okay, how can we improve this experience? And we got a number of different suggestions from students, and they were good suggestions. We loved them. But then one young woman raised her hand. And I still get emotional about this moment. And her name's Jamie Kelleher. She's out in Colorado now, working on a graduate degree. But she said, we weren't sure you were serious about us doing what we wanted to do. And then we realized you were, and it was really cool. And I looked at Karen Hyman, my associate director, and she looked at me, and we said, whoa, something important just happened. But we didn't know how important it was, because from that moment on, the students just started to take initiative. They got on buses and went up to Chicago to see their advisors at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. They went out to California for a conference on student entrepreneurship. They just started to take initiative without our permission, and we loved it. They invited speaker from IDEO down to campus. I didn't know about it till they were there. They ran a conference on student entrepreneurship up at the University of Chicago without any involvement of I Foundry staff. Not the University of Illinois, the University of Chicago. So they just started to do stuff. It was so beautiful. And I remember at the time, Mark and I were talking about this, but we were looking at this and we didn't understand it, because our expectation was that what we had done was too small. We said, well, we haven't done enough. We haven't done enough curriculum design. We haven't put enough effort into this for anything good to happen from it. And all this good stuff's happening, and we're going, well, what's it about? Well, first thing we did was try to assess it, because our assessment schedule was on a longer time horizon. So I told our assessors, get in there and measure this. So they went in and they started, and we have some quantitative results, but I'm showing you some of the qualitative results. I'm sure I made the right career choice. Beautiful. Making me more confident in my decision to be an engineer. Great. I'm definitely more entrepreneurial, and this is my favorite. Just an overall all-rounded engineer, not just a technician, a human, not just a problem solver. I'm going, whoa, what did we do? And I remember I called Mark. Shara Kearns was working with us at Olin at the time, and I said, Mark and Shara, we think we've got the Olin effect here at Illinois, but we can't explain it. Because we didn't spend the money, we didn't do all the things that you guys did, but we got something like what your kids were expressing, a deep connection with what it means to be an engineer, a deep identity. And we're going, but how? And so I think one of the question we want to leave you with from this story is how did such a small effort have such a big effect? $100,000, not a big curriculum overhaul. How did it get the right stuff emotionally? to try to answer, and actually I remember, Mark, I remember our conversations. We used the language of intrinsic motivation, and we thought that was helpful, and we'll say more about intrinsic motivation in a minute, but it just didn't seem like it was enough, and it seemed like our language was inadequate. Any comment about?
Yeah, I certainly remember that conversation and the extent to which we were confused at that time. I think it was amazing to see the students doing that, and certainly from an Olin perspective, we recognized those types of unleashed behaviors as exactly the kinds of things we were seeing in our students, sort of moving into the sort of space of taking initiative and taking responsibility for own learning and being excited, but at the same time, it was very hard for us to look at what was going on at Illinois and provide an explanation, because I think we had this very sort of complicated and lengthy and big picture explanation of what was happening at Olin, but it wasn't consistent with what we were seeing at Illinois.
Well, and when you guys visited us in 2008, I remember Rick Miller saying, well, first thing you do is you go build a dormitory and to help you form community. And we said, well, that's not practical for us because we'll be locked in discussions with the Student Services Office for about the next 5 years. But we did hear the language of community, and so that's where the I-community came from. We transferred the idea, but not the particular implementation mode. And I remember Shara telling, okay, well, the first thing you do is you recreate design nature and 2 or 3 of the other courses. And again, we had a budget for a pea shooter, not a budget for a Cadillac or a howitzer. I'm mixing my metaphors, but it was the whole thing was puzzling. It was like something was missing in the language. The language of intrinsic motivation wasn't enough. And so I want to tell one more story. I mentioned to you that in 2010 I went to Singapore, and one of the blessings there was I got to travel around and talk to lots of different people. And I had around the time Mark and I were writing the book, I had an invitation to go to Hwa Chong Institution. Now, if you know Singapore, Hwa Chong is the top high school. There's just no doubt about it. Like all the generals, it's still the case. All the generals that are chiefs of staff of the Army, Navy, and Air Force of Singapore were Hwa Chong graduates in high school. The minister, if kids smart enough, gets sent to Hwa Chong. Hwa Chong kids go to Oxford and they go to MIT and they go wherever they want to go. So these are the great kids, cream of the crop. I was invited to talk to 15 and 16-year-olds about leadership, and so actually one of the funny experiences of going to Singapore generally was I call it Singaporean students don't do X. So when I went to NUS and was talking to my engineering colleagues, they said, "Look, Dave, you're not in the United States anymore, and Singaporean students don't do X." So the first thing they said was, "Dave, they won't answer your questions in class." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." So I got together with my colleagues and we had kind of a freshman class, first year students, and we did some of the things that we did in I Foundry, and the kids were beautiful. They answered the questions. They said, "Well, Dave, you got lucky. Singaporean students won't do emotion." And actually in Singapore, so it's an interesting contrast going from Singapore to Brazil. Singapore is one of the least emotional countries on the planet, and this country is one of the more emotional countries on the planet. But anyways, in Singapore, they said they won't do emotion. So I'm working with these groups of 3-4 students on their projects and getting at, well, why did you work on that project? Trying to get at sort of the emotional core of why that project was important to them. And so I remember a conversation, a Singaporean student of Indian background, and he said, he's telling me, "Oh, I'm working on a food project." I said, "Oh, great, tell me about that. Why is food important to you?" "Well, I just want to help people." I said, "Beautiful. So, but why? Why is I didn't have to do. I think I got about 3 whys. I didn't have to do the 5 whys. So I'm asking why. Well, why? And he says, well, and ultimately it came out that his grandfather was a farmer who lived through a famine. And his father was a farmer who also had hard times on the farm. And so food was very personal to him. And And so Singaporean students will answer your questions, they will do a motion. And so but anyway, so now I'm asked to talk about leadership, and I was talking about presence and the connection of presence and body. We're embodied as leaders, but how that also is about being present to what happens. Not, I was talking about effectuation as opposed to planning, and that sometimes life happens and something different happens than what you expect, and you need to be present to what happens. So we're having this great conversation about presence, these 15 and 16-year-olds, and it's just beautiful. And they're of course, when I went to Hua Chong, my Singaporean colleagues there said, well, Dave, I said, I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to work with a microphone interactively, and they were shocked. They were horrified, but it was great. It was a beautiful conversation. And so we're having this conversation, and we're talking about leadership presence. What is leadership presence, I say? So I said, tell me some great leaders you know that have great presence. Mahatma Gandhi. Oh, beautiful answer. Love it. Tell me who else. So Bill Clinton. Okay, great answer. Barack Obama. They gave other world leaders that have good presence. And so we're having this. And what does it mean to have good presence? Well, you feel connected to them. Great. I love that. What else? You trust them. Anyways, they're giving these wonderful answers, and it was a great afternoon. Just a short interaction with them. So we go into Q&A, and we're in, here's Hua Chong, there's the main building. And we're in this auditorium. This isn't from that day, but this is that auditorium. We're in this auditorium. I'm doing like I did before, roving with my microphone, and we're doing a little Q&A. And so the kids, I said, well, okay, what's your questions? People asked some questions. We had a nice discussion. So a young woman raises her hand, and she asks the following question. How do you learn the courage to be present as a leader? The question stopped me in my tracks. It was her use of the word courage. It's exactly the right word. Mark had the word fearless on the slide, and that got people to come to Olin. But actually, when you have fear, how do you overcome it? You have the courage to step into it. And we reflected on that answer and other experiences that we had, and we realized that the language that we were using was bereft of emotion. Just didn't have enough emotion in it. So we started to use more emotional words in describing what we were doing. And so we've come to kind of a formula that there's kind of a chain of events that takes place in this kind of learning. That somebody trusts you. You can trust yourself. A colleague can trust you. A professor can trust you. Somebody trusts you. And that trust empowers you by giving you what? Giving you the courage to take initiative. And then maybe fail. And continue and persevere and succeed. Open to your exploration and learning, not judging you when things don't go well. And stepping into it and allowing you to succeed and have authentic learning. And we realized that it was that language that opens the doors to the kind of things that we want in higher education in the 21st century. And so we call this the unleashing reaction. We saw the students at Olin and I Foundry as unleashed in a very profound way. Mark, do you want to add to this at all?
No, I think that captures it.
All right. And so all the key variables are emotional at the level of individuals. At the level of organizations, all the key levels are cultural, in much the same way that Carlos Brito was talking about yesterday. And so to go back to the question that we started with, how do we balance our portfolio for students and faculty? What do we balance? I know, I'm an expert, I know. What do we balance that with? The survival of the university, Mark and I think, depends on not content, curriculum, and pedagogy, although this is where we usually start. We started at Olin and I Foundry with these things. We now believe those aren't the key variables. And people talk about ed tech. It's not about MOOCs. MOOCs are enabling of certain things, but it's not about MOOCs. it's a better balance of knowing and trusting from the professor's point of view, so that the university becomes something different. Instead of it being I know, it's we trust, we trust, we trust. And from the student's perspective, that shifts. It's not just obedience, there's discipline, there's learning and mastering the stuff. You need to master the method before you go out in the world and help your clients. But there's also I initiate, I innovate, and respecting that. And so the assembly of experts that the university has been for almost 10 centuries becomes an assembly of joyful and trusting and trusted learners working together. And the shift is a big one. It's a balance, a better balance of head and heart in profoundly different ways. So in the book, we talk about this. We talk, how do you do this in practice? In the book, we try to be explicit about it. So we say, engineering has been about analysis and design. But it's also about people. It's about speech in ways that we are clear about in the book. It's about showing up as embodied leaders in different ways. And it's about reflection and mindfulness. It's about thinking about our own thoughts and feelings and the thoughts and feelings of others more regularly. It's about a backdrop, a culture, Professor Falconi called it out, of joy. So what is that? That's a shift from the negative emotions of fear, resignation, jealousy, other negative emotions, to one that's more joyful. Actually, there's in the book there's a story about Honda, the origins of the quality movement and modern origins in Japanese practices. Beautiful story about joy in the book. It's about courage, showing up with your whole heart and stepping into things. It's about openness and connection, the kind of connection and community I felt yesterday here. It's a kind of an emotional rescue, with apologies to Mick Jagger and the boys. So how do we do this in practice? How do we accomplish this in practice? And we call them the technologies of trust. And we think it's a method akin to the method that's used in Quality Circle to get results. But how do we regularize this? How do we make these practices easier for people to do? So Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about mindset?
Yeah, well, I think one of the places to start in trying to move into a space of trust and a space of joy and a space of courage is to recognize the ways that we tend to frame things historically that we have, and what some of the modern science tells us in psychology and in economics. So one piece of that has to do with what you might call the technology of mindset and the technology of intrinsic motivation. So if you think about how we've usually thought about things, certainly in the university, and I can't comment beyond that, one of the things that university professors tend to think is that some students are smart and some students aren't, and there's nothing you can do about that. And another thing that the university professors often think is that rewards and punishments are the most effective ways to motivate people. You give someone a good grade, that will encourage them to do well. If you threaten someone with a bad grade, that will encourage them to improve their behavior. And those are really, in some ways, thought of as the laws of emotional physics for a long time. But if you look at more recent literature, that's clearly actually not the case. So one person who's really influenced us enormously has been Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist at Stanford University. She's done work on mindset. And she makes this distinction between what she calls a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. So people who have a fixed mindset are characterized by thinking of their intelligence as a fixed quantity. And because they think of their intelligence as a fixed quantity, they're very cautious about challenges. They avoid challenges because if challenges are present, if they hit a challenge that they can't overcome, it's going to show people that they are not actually as intelligent as they want to be. They see trying to get better things as sort of fruitless, because the only reason you would try to get better things was if it wasn't actually the case that your abilities were fixed. But since your abilities are fixed, why even try? And they're threatened by criticism, they're threatened by success from others because they don't see that they can actually do anything about who they are and what their abilities are. So although people with a fixed mindset can be very, very bright, people with a fixed mindset end up not getting very far and not achieving their full potential. She finds that also people can have what she calls a growth mindset. And a growth mindset is a mindset that says, instead of my thinking of my intelligence as some fixed quantity, I'm going to think of my intelligence like a muscle, like something that I can improve through practice. And people who have a growth mindset demonstrate a number of characteristics. They embrace challenges. When they face a setback, they say, this setback is something that I can persist in, that I can get better from. They think that working at things actually makes them better at things and makes them smarter. They're able to take criticism in a positive way and learn from it. They're able to take inspiration and lessons from the success of others. So she's found in her research these two types of mindsets exist. But what's particularly interesting is not just that they exist, but that it's actually possible to adopt one or the other, to learn to adopt a growth mindset or to learn to adopt a fixed mindset. And so one of the things that we think is really important is that often it's the case that organizations and universities adopt a fixed mindset and therefore push people within their organization to adopt a fixed mindset. And by the same token, it's possible for an organization to adopt a growth mindset to say, hey, you can get better at things. And by adopting that growth mindset, to teach the members of that organization to adopt that mindset as well. And it's really some pretty compelling research that she's done in this space, and we've certainly seen the difference that that can make in the university setting. Related to that is the technology of intrinsic motivation, and this sort of has to do with rewards and punishment. The idea being that in historically, we've thought that the way that you get someone to do something is you pay them a bonus for doing it. But if you actually look at the literature and look at what psychology tells us, the reality is that people are much more creative and much more effective and work much harder and learn much better when they are doing things because they're excited about doing them. And so it's possible by being intentional to create an environment that supports intrinsic motivation and that leads to better outcomes. This is very different from the way that we often think about students. We often think about people as being either motivated people or unmotivated people, but the reality is that people are actually motivated differently in different situations. And to illustrate that, I want to show you two pictures. So one of the things we always hear at Olin over and over again is, oh, you can do that at Olin because your students at Olin are so motivated. Well, here's a picture of some Olin students. These students are not very motivated students. They're having a hard time figuring out why they're there and why they're doing what they're doing. They're not very happy. Here are some students in that very same class who are motivated. They've just succeeded in casting a brass cannon as part of an integrated course. They're really excited about the work they've done. You can see from the smiles on their faces that they are really just engaged and excited, and they're engaged and excited after having spent far, far longer working on this project than one might realistically expect students to. So what's the difference between those two? The difference between those two is that the situation is different. The way that the environment around those students has been created is different and is actually can even differ on a day-to-day basis. And it's possible to be intentional about creating an environment that shifts motivation. The way that you can do that is by providing people with autonomy, addressing their need to actually feel like they're in control of their environment. Providing people with the opportunity to feel connected to others, to feel like their work matters, and providing people with the opportunity to actually feel like they're getting better at things. If you're intentional about creating those features in an environment, you can actually cause significant shifts in the way that people are motivated. So we think that rather than thinking about people as having fixed intelligence, and rather than thinking about a motivation as being about sticks and carrots, if we employ some of the new school technologies of positive psychology and of intrinsic motivation, it's possible to achieve very different outcomes than you achieve using the old school approach of fear and of assuming that people are fixed in their intelligence. So
yeah,
Dave, do you want to talk about?
I do. And so I mentioned, so one of the old school approaches to things is what we were talking about in the large of the notion of the professor as expert. The professor tells students, listen, shut up, listen, And so this idea of expertise and telling is embedded in the assumptions of the university. So how do we change that? Well, we think actually, my experience, and there's stories to tell, there's stories in the book about my experience in being trained as a leadership coach and now and working with people as a coach. But the technology of coaching has kind of exploded on the global scene over the last 20, 25 years or so. And there are reasons for it, and it's embedded in the kinds of practices and knowledge that's applied. But an expert shares his knowledge, and then students, or perhaps junior consultants, demonstrate their mastery, a static mastery of those subjects on a project in a certain way or in class. What does a coach do differently from that? A coach is less about telling and more about having the student discover and really own the material in a different way. And that's when there's stories to tell around that in terms of how that can take place. But it's this deep trust of others as resourceful, creative, and whole. So if you go in believing that students are ignorant and unable to figure things out on their own, that's a big shift to really believe in students. And so how do we? And one of the things that when I took training as a coach at Georgetown, I said, my gosh, this stuff is so fundamental. It blew my mind. It changed my life. But why? Why does a CEO have to spend $400 or $500 an hour to get a coach when they're already successful? We don't give coaches or coaching skills to people until they're that successful. It made no sense to me. This stuff is like kindergarten stuff. This is like human being 101. Why do we postpone human being 101? And what is it about? It's about noticing and awareness. It's about deep listening. I heard yesterday about listening. How do we listen? It's about asking of open-ended questions, about negotiation. It's about being, in addition to knowing and doing. It's about understanding and reframing your stories. It's about being appreciative. So why is it that we don't do this stuff lots earlier? So we think one of the big shifts in the school of the future is that professors will be better balancers of their expertise and these coaching skills to draw students out. Mark, do you want to do?
Yeah, so I think one of the other things that we think is really striking, and certainly in looking at the academy, right? Dave mentioned earlier that the University of Bologna started 1,000 years ago, and particularly within the academy, there is the assumption that things in the academy are the way they are because that's the way they are. So here's a picture, for example, of students taking a test, and often in the academy we don't question whether we're doing things. Why we're actually doing things. We just do things because we do things. We think there's a sort of core technology that we can apply in the university, and it certainly has been applied outside of the university, having to do with being more explicit about questioning why things the way they are. And we find particularly that Edgar Schein's work on organizational culture is informative on that. So Schein proposes a model that says that culture has to do with the extent to which there are a set of shared tacit assumptions, that is, things that people sort of tacitly believe to be true, but they don't even articulate to be true. And when people come into a new group, those new members of the group are taught how to perceive the world through those tacit assumptions. And so Schein has a model for culture that basically says culture exists at three levels. There's sort of the stuff you see, right, the artifacts, so the fact that students are sitting in a room taking a test. There are the reasons that people might give you for those things being the way they are. So if you ask instructors, why is it that students take a test, they'll tell you the reason is that we need to find out how much students know, or students need to take a test in this way because we need to make sure they don't cheat. But then if you question those reasons, those espoused values and those espoused beliefs more deeply, you get to some of the underlying assumptions. So for example, in the way that we give tests in the university, there is often an underlying assumption that students cannot be trusted. And that's not even something that people necessarily say out loud, but it's an underlying assumption that drives the way that we behave within the culture.
Mark,
so we think that there's a great opportunity in the university and also in the world in general, to be much more explicit about questioning assumptions, about quite sort of taking a given artifact and saying, why is this here, and what are we assuming about the way the world is that leads us to behave in this way? And as we actually question those assumptions and understand our culture, it's also possible to change culture in a way. Because one of the things, and we think this in part because as we think about the story of I Foundry, when we think about the story of Olin, one of the things that we think is critical in both of those cases is the extent to which there were choices made about artifacts that were related to explicit choices or implicit choices about what the underlying assumptions would be about the way that students are, the way that faculty are, and the way that an institution might be.
Yeah, and Mark, actually I was reflecting, is my mic on? Yeah, now it is. I was reflecting on the ways in which, right now we're in a Falconi artifact. Movimento Falconi is an artifact of your culture. And it's an important one. And so what are if you were to think about Shine's model in the context of what we're doing now, and think about the people who were here yesterday and today, what's that artifact about, and what does that say about your culture at all three levels? And I've been thinking about these slides in connection with my experience here over the last few days. I'll just go ahead.
I'm going to hand to you, Dave, because I actually do need to say farewell in just a few minutes here. So
okay, so yeah, thanks for that, Mark. So this, one of the ways in which we think the university needs to change is thinking about the process of change. So we often think in universities that we can use the existing bureaucracy to make changes. When I Foundry was started and made official by my dean, he said he wanted to make it into a committee. And I Foundry was a rejection of the formation of a committee and forming a group of faculty. And so we're adherents to people like John Cotter and the Heath brothers, Sarasvati on effectuation. How do we bring other kinds of change processes? Of course, the method is a change process for certain kinds of routinization of work. But how do we bring into how do we make bigger changes, more entrepreneurial changes in systematic ways? Cotter talks now about needing a dual operating system if the changes are sufficiently large, and so in that way, we think of I Foundry as, and for that matter, Olin College as a way to create transformative change by creating a dual operating system separate from the standard operating system if you really want to make big cultural change. So to sort of bring this together, and I hope you can hang around for a few minutes because we're going to get to some Q&A, Mark. But we think that the changes in the world require a new balance in lots of our institutions. Some of the conversation yesterday was about government and its dysfunction, and the ways in which our companies need change, and the ways in which our universities need change. And so we think that the world is calling us to have a better balance of knowing and trusting, and obeying and discipline and initiation and innovation from times past because of the missed revolutions. And we think these ideas, we're pretty sure these ideas are central for higher ed and engineering ed. And so our question to you, and I think our final conversation, is in what ways do these carry over to educating consultants and to consulting practice? In what ways do these things matter to you here? And so with that, I guess I'd just like to take our last few minutes and let's do one more time. Again, in your groups, take and reflect on the talk and in what ways do these things that we've been talking about here over the last little while matter to you, matter to Falconi. So get in your groups of 2 or 3 again, have a conversation. We'll do it a little bit shorter, so maybe a couple, 2-3 minutes, and we'll come back together. Is it clear? Okay, go for it. 30 seconds. Okay, so let's come back together. And so, in what ways does this stuff matter to you? In what ways does this matter to Falconi? And in your response, try to make it kind of a crisp, reasonably short sentence, just so we can get around to a lot of people in the time remaining. So in what ways does this stuff that we've been talking about matter? What are your takeaways from our conversation this morning? Anyone?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was amazing. That's the only way I can describe it. We are discussing about it, and we believe that it's all about the balance between the proactive students and the expert professors. The old tradition and the change that the young people bring to the university.
Yeah, beautiful, great. What else? Nice. What else? What other? Yeah, so we're running low. I want to get some of what's the thoughts, other thoughts in the room, and we'll have time afterwards to talk individually. What else? What else does this mean?
Here.
What takeaways do you have from the conversation? Yeah, thanks.
I think one of the most important things that you have just taught us is what about engagement. How can you engage in students and become more proactive and create the world around them? And that was one of the most important things about autonomy. How can guide them and their aspirations on how to, what would they like to do in their lives, and how can create the world around them.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and what does that mean here at Falconi?
I think for Falconi, we are led by an aspiration to create a better world and society, and that was what led us to become a better professional and do a better job in their organizations.
Yeah, great. Beautiful. What else? What other takeaways? We've got time for a couple more. Yeah.
It actually means that we must take charge of our education. We don't have to wait for our leader to tell us, you must read this book. We should actually be proactive in looking for the knowledge, even if you have to study at the weekend or anything else, because if we don't take charge of it, no one would.
Yeah. Nice.
Para mim, eu vou falar em português. Não, acho que para mim o principal mensagem que ficou, e acho que ela serve demais para todo esse time, falando aqui agora como um engenheiro, como um amigo da turma Falconi e como cliente, né, que hoje tem a Falconi dentro da nossa empresa. Eu acho que a grande takeaway, oportunidade, é vocês perceberem que tem muito mais necessidade no mundo da paixão do empreendedor do que do conhecimento do consultor. O artigo raro que a gente enfrenta, o artigo difícil de achar, escasso, é jovem, apaixonado, com capacidade de realizar. Cada vez que um consultor chega lá dentro da nossa empresa e tem esse espírito, independente de quanto ele sabe, se ele veio de uma faculdade muito boa, se ele não veio, rapidamente você vê que ao redor dele tem uma espécie de gente motivada, do tipo do I Foundry, do tipo do que a gente viu em Olin, fazendo muito mais do que o próprio projeto estava pedindo. E quando isso não acontece, tem lá um monte de PMO tentando bater o tambor e dizendo, olha, minha gente, está atrasado, está atrasado, está atrasado. E a diferença entre um e outro é brutal. Então, acho que tudo que está sendo dito aqui, na verdade, é 100% de takeaway. Construir mais consultor empreendedor vai criar muito mais resultado para a Falconi, vai criar muito mais resultado para a gente, e o mundo precisa do sonho e da capacidade dessa turma toda jovem aí fazendo esse tipo de trabalho. Esse, para mim, é o takeaway.
Obrigado.
Hi.
Very nice.
Here.
Hello?
Yeah.
One key takeaway that I had with my colleagues here was about the coaching that you mentioned.
Yep.
And how do we shift from the old school teaching kind of approach to a more coaching focused approach. And I think here at Falconi we have a lot to learn from coaching, and we can take advantage of that in our projects. I mean, from the leader to the team. How do we take more advantage of the coaching process to
and sometimes
potentialize the learning?
Yeah, beautiful. Sometimes we go overboard on that, and we think that we have to give up. So it's not that our expertise goes away; it's that our expertise gets balanced by better noticing and listening, better creativity and innovation, as opposed to the fixed method. So it's a new balance, but it builds on top of the old school. Great stuff. Yeah. Maybe one more, and then I think we're a little bit over time, so we've got one more.
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. Really enlightened us with a lot of points and really pertinent for us as consultants.
Yes.
We could take a lot of takeaways from your presentation. Maybe
give me one.
Yeah, probably many of us were thinking that you were going to point at us how to apply those concepts to consultancy, but you actually posed the question and made us think. And the most important takeaway that I think it was the autonomy and trust in the leader, in the team. The leader can give the team and makes them create and innovate, not telling us what to do exactly. So this was the biggest contribution my previous leader gave it to me, was actually trusting myself, maybe more than I did, and made me innovate, think wider, outside the box. Yeah. And one thing that I balance, on the other hand, for us, is on the projects, we have the limitation of time.
Sure.
And sometimes we don't have time to actually make this try and errors process that stimulates creation.
Yes.
And this is a challenge for us to apply this. I think the United States society stimulates the error more than we do, the Brazilians. We are afraid to take risks, and that's why we don't innovate as much as American society, I think. It's because you do stimulate error, you do stimulate taking risks, and that's why innovation and creation comes as consequences.
Yeah. Beautiful point, and thank you for noticing that the way we designed what we were doing was to trust you and to believe in your ability to take our results and apply them in your own situation. So thank you so much for noticing that. And I think, and given the time, I want to close on the point that you just made. Yesterday, I was listening to the conversations about the Brazil problem, and I was thinking about the role of this company in getting this country to where it is now. That you actually, you have the current Brazil problem because of the good work of this company in changing industry across this nation. And so the question that I think we want to leave you with is the problems of yesterday and the Brazil problem are problems that probably can be solved, or at least partially solved, by whatever the next step is. And I think Mark and I want to just leave you with that we trust the people, the good people, and I wasn't exaggerating when I think I'm among hundreds of the best consultants in the world. We trust you to carry forward with the traditions of this company and go forward into a world that balances head and heart in a productive way that gets results. So thank you so much for letting us share this time with you.
La ley universal de la locomoción no puede